Socioeconomic school segregation in a market-oriented educational system, the case of Chile. Juan Pablo Valenzuela, Cristian Beley, and Danae de los Rios. This paper presents an empirical analysis of the economic status SES school segregation in Chile, whose educational system is regarded as an extreme case of a market-oriented education. This study estimated the magnitude and evolution of the SES segregation of schools at both national and local levels. And it studied the relationship between some local educational market dynamics and the observed magnitude of SES school segregation at municipal level. The main findings were, first, the magnitude of the SES segregation of both low SES and high SES students in Chile was very high. Duncan index ranged from 0.5 to 0.6 in 2008. Second, during the last decade, SES school segregation tended to slightly increase in Chile, especially in high schools, both public and private schools. Third, private schools, including voucher schools, were more segregated than public schools for both low SES and high SES students. And finally, some market dynamics operating in the Chilean education, like privatization, school choice, and fee paying, accounted for a relevant proportion of the observed variation in SES school segregation at municipal level. These findings are analyzed from an educational policy perspective in which the link between SES school segregation and market-oriented mechanisms in education plays a fundamental role. Keywords: equity, social justice, research. Introduction. The policy relevance of school segregation. The educational policy relevance of the socioeconomic status SES segregation of the school-going population, defined broadly as the uneven distribution among schools of children with a different social and economic characteristics, is essentially grounded in three concerns. Firstly, school has traditionally been seen as a channel for socialization that enriches by complementing the family experience. This is especially so in terms of introducing students to the complexities of social life. One of whose case characteristics is interacting with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. School segregation may hinder the civic function. Secondly, given that education is an interactive process between teachers and students, and among students, the people, their capacities, resources, attitudes, and preferences that make up the school constitute an essential part of the nature of the educational experience. Thus, regarding students' socioeconomic segregation emerges as a relevant component in the quest for higher quality and equity in education, especially for low-income students. Lastly, social policies, including educational policies, targeted at improving the conditions of the poor and disadvantaged, face additional obstacles when tackling poverty concentration in a broad sense. In other words, the segregation of disadvantaged groups will raise their degree of vulnerability and strengthen their exclusion. From this point of view, it is not so much the case that segregation is a solution to the educational problems of the poor, but rather that segregation will hinder the solution to those problems. In this paper, we report an empirical research on the socioeconomic school segregation of the Chilean educational system, which is a valuable context to study the relationship between school segregation and market-oriented reforms in education. In an international educational context in which many countries are attempting market-oriented policies to improve schools' performance, this research is relevant because Chile is one of the countries with the highest private participation in the schooling system. Moreover, the Chilean educational system is characterized by a broad concept of school choice, a generalized voucher-like funding mechanism, multiple for-profit and not-for-profit private providers, both with and without public subsidies, and an extended system of family co-payment across private subsidized schools. However, few studies have been published connecting these features with school segregation. Historically, both racial and economic residential segregation have been widely studied in the USA. See, for example, Park 1926, Abramson, Tobin, and Van der Goot 1995. Nevertheless, although Park 1926 defined segregation very early as the relation between the physical and social distance of certain groups or individuals, there is no consensus about the conceptual definition of segregation. White 1983, James and Tauber 1985, Mazzei and Denton 1988, Jargowski 1996, Rodriguez 2001, Sabatini, etc. In this study, we analyzed segregation as unevenness, which refers to the difference in the distribution of population groups in geographical and/or organizational units. Certainly, unevenness is a relative and not an absolute concept. A group is deemed segregated if it is distributed differently compared to another group in particular units. Later in the research design section, we expand on this conceptual discussion. In general terms, the harmful effects of residential segregation are well established in the literature, including negative impacts on labor market opportunities, Clutter and Glisser, 1997, etc. Health aspects and political efficacy are certainly on educational opportunities and outcomes. Although less developed, the research about both socioeconomics and ethnic segregation in education is also a dynamic field of study in many countries. Broadly, previous research has found that controlling for other relevant factors disadvantaged students attending more segregated schools tend to have higher dropout rates and lower levels of academic achievement. Additionally, researchers have also identified negative consequences of school segregation on students' risk behaviors and psychosocial aspects linked to school success. Example, motivation. Among disadvantaged students, the study of the consequences of school segregation has been strongly influenced by the discussion on the compositional effects and more specifically on peer effects. The theory suggests that within classrooms, peer, SES, and cognitive abilities are important predictors of students' achievement. Even though the literature on the effects of the composition of schools and classes dates back to the publication of the Coleman report, systematic efforts to measure those effects on students' learning are quite recent. Unfortunately, the research on compositional and peer effects has faced conceptual limitations and problems of data quality. Many studies have been hindered by small sample sizes, while other results have been affected by high student mobility or the lack of information on teacher quality. However, recent studies have improved econometric techniques suggesting that the effects of composition may be important. There is presently a significant debate on whether peer effects are decreasing or constant, and whether they are homogeneous or heterogeneous, two issues closely related to the discussion on school segregation. Some researchers argue that if we assume that the peer effect has diminishing returns in learning, decreasing effects and increase in school segregation should produce a reduction in aggregating educational outcomes, and achievements gap will increase among different population groups. On the other hand, heterogeneous peer effect has been identified by studies in several countries, although there is no consensus on the nature of this heterogeneity. Studies linking school segregation with student academic achievements tend to show that disadvantaged students in terms of family SES, race, or academic achievement will benefit from low levels of school segregation. Nevertheless, the findings are not conclusive about whether or not non-disadvantaged students will be negatively affected by low levels of school segregation. We interpret this literature as suggesting that compositional and peer effects, both positive and negative, may be stronger for vulnerable groups. Overall, the current evidence supports the notion that the level of socioeconomic school segregation is a relevant characteristic of the educational systems, and that consequently educational policies should be discussed in terms of their potential contribution to either increase or decrease SES school segregation. Thus, the main purpose of this study was to provide a better understanding of students' socioeconomic segregation in the Chilean school system by estimating its magnitude, analyzing its recent evolution, and exploring its relationship with some of the market dynamics that characterize Chilean education in addition to residential segregation. Socioeconomic school segregation and educational market dynamics, the Chilean context. Market-oriented educational policies are currently being discussed in many countries, especially as an alternative to more traditional school improvement initiative within the public sector. Market-oriented policies in education include voucher programs, school choice, privatization, cost recovery mechanisms, and the promotion of competition among schools. Promoters affirm that the introduction of some of those market mechanisms to education will increase the effectiveness and efficiency of schools. In contrast, detractors predict that market dynamics will damage public schools and increase inequity in education without certain gains in education quality. As stated from a comparative perspective, Chilean educational system is one of the most extreme cases of the introduction of market-oriented reforms. In fact, all the mentioned market-oriented policies have been implemented in Chile at national level since 1980. This makes Chile an attractive case for all researchers and policymakers interested in the potential effects of large-scale market-oriented reforms. In fact, the consequences of market reforms in Chilean education have been intensively studied during the last 3 decades. Overall, researchers have found small or no impact of those policies on improving the quality of Chilean education, CBLA, etc., and some negative consequences on educational equity, such as increasing test score gap between low and high SES students and disseminating cream skimming practices based on students' performance and discipline, all of which are negatively affected public schools. Within this context, the concern for SES school segregation has recently started to emerge in Chile. Nevertheless, this issue has scarcely been empirically studied. For example, an OECD report affirmed that some Chilean educational policies exacerbated school segregation, but provided no direct evidence to support that statement. This paper aims to contribute to solve that gap. Certainly, SES school segregation has sources beyond the educational system. Residential segregation is probably the most relevant external factor explaining educational segregation, since parents, especially for young children, tend to choose schools that are relatively nearer to home. Previous research on urban areas in Chile has found that the level of SES residential segregation was intermediate at national level, but it was high in the metropolitan region of Santiago. Studies also estimated that residential segregation has tended to slightly decrease in the last decades. Thus, a key policy question is whether educational systems merely reproduce residential segregation within educational institutions, or whether they increase or reduce it. We hypothesized that in addition to the urban segregation in socioeconomic segregation of the Chilean education could be explained by some market-oriented mechanisms, such as the universal parent school choice, the significant presence of private schools, especially voucher schools, and the co-payment system, a fee-paying regulation within state-funded schools. School choice is a potential contributing factor to SES educational segregation in Chile. This mechanism, which is aimed at raising the degree of competition among schools, will be a powerful increase to school stratification, since parents with higher SES tend to seek out high-performance schools and more prestigious schools for their children, producing a polarization of schools by national class and by students' achievement, which are in turn highly correlated. This phenomenon of social class-related school choice has been theoretically predicted. Privatization in education can also lead to higher SES school segregation. In fact, several authors report a high degree of SES stratification by type of school ownership in Chile, While low SES students tend to attend public schools, middle SES students tend to attend voucher private schools, and high SES students tend to attend non-subsidized private schools. In Chile, there are two complementary reasons that potentially link the preference of private schools to SES school segregation. The first factor is the selection of students by the schools through highly unregulated admission policies. As recently as in 2009, a legal norm that partially regulated schools' selection until 6th grade was established. Schools have powerful incentives for selecting children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and with better academic performance, since the costs of teaching those children, both monetary and non-monetary, are lower. In Chile, these incentives increase given the test-based accountability policies. There is some evidence that indicates that those class-related and achievement-related student selection practices are more relevant in private schools, both non-subsidized and voucher, than in public schools. The second factor is the Chilean voucher mechanisms, since the amount of this demand side subside has been the same for all students independently of their SES. In this context, the theory predicts that there should be a higher degree of segregation in voucher private schools than in public schools,